What started as a routine late-night interview quickly spiraled into television chaos when Mel Gibson abruptly walked off Stephen Colbert's show following a heated exchange that left audiences stunned and social media ablaze. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was supposed to be another typical Tuesday night in television. The guest lineup featured Academy Award-winning actor and director Mel Gibson, who was scheduled to promote his latest directorial project. What viewers witnessed instead was one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations in recent late-night television history. Gibson walked onto the Ed Sullivan Theater stage to his usual warm applause, settling into the guest chair with what appeared to be his characteristic confidence. Colbert, known for his sharp wit and political commentary, began with standard pleasantries about Gibson's career and current projects. The conversation initially flowed smoothly, with Gibson discussing his latest film and sharing behind-the-scenes anecdotes that had the studio audience engaged and laughing. However, the atmosphere shifted dramatically when Colbert steered the conversation toward Gibson's past controversies. The host's tone became noticeably more pointed as he referenced Gibson's well-documented struggles with alcohol and his previous inflammatory statements that had damaged his reputation in Hollywood. Gibson's body language immediately changed. His relaxed posture stiffened, and his smile faded as Colbert pressed forward with increasingly personal questions. "You've had quite the journey back from some pretty dark places," Colbert said, leaning forward in his chair. "Some people might say you've been given more second chances than most people would ever receive in this industry." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Gibson's jaw visibly tightened as he processed what felt less like an interview question and more like an accusation. Gibson attempted to deflect with humor, making a self-deprecating joke about his past mistakes, but Colbert wasn't satisfied with the surface-level response. He continued probing, asking pointed questions about accountability and whether Gibson truly understood the impact of his actions on marginalized communities. The studio audience, initially entertained by the back and forth, began to sense the tension building between the two men. "I think I've been pretty clear about learning from my mistakes," Gibson replied, his voice carrying a slight edge. "I've apologized, I've done the work, and I've tried to be better. I'm not sure what more you want from me, Stephen." The use of Colbert's first name felt deliberate, almost confrontational, as if Gibson was establishing that this was no longer just a friendly chat between host and guest. Colbert, however, seemed energized by Gibson's defensive response. He leaned back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he was just getting started. "But words are easy, aren't they? Actions are what really matter. And some of your recent projects have raised eyebrows about whether you've really changed at all." The accusation was thinly veiled, and Gibson's face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and embarrassment. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Camera operators adjusted their positions to capture every micro-expression, while audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was no longer entertainment. It was becoming a public confrontation between two powerful figures in the entertainment industry, with one clearly holding the upper hand as the host on his own show. Gibson's response was measured but firm. "Stephen, I came here to talk about my work, not to be lectured about my past. I've taken responsibility for my actions, and I don't think it's appropriate for you to use your platform to continue attacking me." The word attacking seemed to trigger something in Colbert, whose demeanor shifted from playfully antagonistic to genuinely confrontational. "Attacking?" Colbert repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I'm asking legitimate questions that the public deserves to have answered. This isn't an attack. It's journalism." The claim felt disingenuous given the late-night comedy show format, and Gibson clearly wasn't buying it. The actor's patience was visibly wearing thin as he realized this interview was turning into something entirely different than what he had agreed to. The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The usual rhythm of late-night television setup, punchline, applause, had been abandoned in favor of raw confrontation. Both men seemed to have forgotten they were being broadcast to millions of viewers as their personal animosity took center stage. Gibson stood up from his chair, his movement sudden enough to startle Colbert. "I think we're done here," Gibson announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. But Colbert wasn't ready to let his guest leave just yet. "Oh, are we?" he replied with a condescending tone that would prove to be the final straw in what was about to become television history. Colbert's mocking question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. The host's smirk widened as he watched Gibson pause mid-stride, the actor's back still turned to him. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the confrontation reached a boiling point that would forever change both men's careers. Gibson slowly turned around, his face a mask of controlled fury that anyone familiar with his most intense film roles would recognize. "Excuse me?" Gibson's voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of calm that precedes a storm. The studio audience could sense the shift in energy. This was no longer about entertainment or even uncomfortable journalism. This had become personal, and everyone in the room knew they were about to witness something that would be replayed endlessly across social media and news outlets for weeks to come. Colbert, either oblivious to the danger or emboldened by his position as host, doubled down on his antagonistic approach. "I said, are we done? Because I don't think we are. You don't get to just walk away when things get uncomfortable, Mel. That's not how this works." His voice carried the authority of someone who believed he held all the cards, forgetting that Gibson was not just another celebrity guest who could be easily intimidated or manipulated. The veteran actor took a step back toward the desk, his movements deliberate and measured. "How this works," Gibson repeated, his voice gaining volume and intensity. "Let me tell you how this works, Stephen. I agreed to come on your show to discuss my work, not to be ambushed by someone who clearly has an agenda. You want to play journalist? Then act like one instead of hiding behind comedy as an excuse for character assassination." The accusation hit its mark. Colbert's composure cracked slightly, his professional mask slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "Character assassination? That's rich coming from you. I'm asking questions that any responsible interviewer would ask. The fact that you can't handle them says more about you than it does about me." The response was calculated to wound, designed to push Gibson further toward an explosive reaction that would make for compelling television. Gibson's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Responsible interviewer? You're a comedian, Stephen, not Edward R. Murrow. Don't pretend this is about journalistic integrity when we both know you're just trying to score cheap points at my expense." The dismissal stung Colbert visibly, his face flushing as Gibson continued. "You want to talk about responsibility? How about taking responsibility for using your platform to bully guests who can't fight back on equal terms?" The word bully seemed to trigger something primal in Colbert. He stood up from behind his desk, abandoning the traditional host-guest dynamic entirely. "Bully? I'm holding you accountable for your actions, something that apparently no one else in your life has been willing to do." The personal attack crossed a line that even the most provocative late-night hosts rarely breached, turning what should have been entertainment into something far more vicious. Gibson's restraint finally snapped. "You want to hold me accountable? Fine. Let's talk about accountability. How about we discuss your own track record, Stephen? Your history of selective outrage and convenient moral posturing. At least I've admitted my mistakes and tried to make amends. You hide behind self-righteousness and pretend you're better than everyone else while tearing people down for entertainment." The studio fell into stunned silence. No guest had ever turned the tables on Colbert so completely, exposing the host's own vulnerabilities and contradictions in front of his home audience. Camera operators scrambled to capture every moment, sensing they were documenting television history in the making. The usual safety net of commercial breaks seemed impossibly far away as both men abandoned all pretense of civility. Colbert's response was pure venom. At least I don't have to worry about going on drunken rants that reveal what I really think about entire groups of people. At least I don't have to spend years trying to rehabilitate my image because I couldn't control my worst impulses. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to hit Gibson where it would hurt most: his ongoing efforts to rebuild his reputation and career. The words hung in the air like poison. Gibson's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and finally, cold rage. The studio audience gasped audibly, finally understanding they were witnessing not just a heated exchange, but a complete breakdown of professional decorum. Security personnel could be seen shifting nervously at the edges of the stage, unsure whether to intervene in what was rapidly becoming a personal war between two entertainment industry titans. Gibson's voice, when he finally spoke, was deadly quiet. "You know what, Stephen? You're absolutely right about one thing. I did make terrible mistakes, but at least I had the courage to admit them and try to be better. You're making your mistakes right now, on live television, and you're too arrogant to even realize it." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Colbert's face contorted with rage, all pretense of professional composure finally abandoned. "Arrogant? I'm arrogant for asking tough questions? For not giving you a free pass like every other sycophantic interviewer who's desperate for access?" His voice rose to a level that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable, the host's carefully cultivated persona crumbling in real time. Gibson stepped closer to the desk, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. "No, Stephen, you're arrogant for thinking you have the moral authority to sit in judgment of anyone. You're arrogant for using your platform to humiliate guests under the guise of holding them accountable. And you're arrogant for believing that your audience tunes in to watch you destroy people rather than entertain them." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Colbert's mouth opened and closed wordlessly for a moment, his usual quick wit failing him when confronted with such raw honesty. The studio lights seemed to spotlight every bead of sweat on his forehead, every telltale sign that he was losing control of his own show. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial or let the train wreck continue unfolding. "You don't know what you're talking about," Colbert finally managed, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "My audience appreciates honest conversation, not the carefully managed publicity stunts that pass for interviews everywhere else." The defense sounded hollow even to his own ears, and Gibson seized on the weakness immediately. "Honest conversation?" Gibson laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a man who's forgotten the difference between asking hard questions and launching personal attacks. Your audience deserves better than watching you use your guests as punching bags for your own entertainment." The criticism stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Several audience members were shifting nervously in their seats, their expressions ranging from fascination to genuine discomfort. This was no longer the Stephen Colbert they had come to see, the clever, satirical host who could skewer politicians and celebrities with wit rather than venom. This was something uglier, more personal, and far less entertaining. Colbert's response was desperate, grasping for any weapon he could find. "Don't lecture me about entertainment value, Mel. At least my show doesn't glorify violence and revenge fantasies. At least I don't make my living celebrating the worst impulses of human nature." The attack on Gibson's filmography was clearly meant to wound, but it only served to highlight how far Colbert had strayed from legitimate criticism into pure malice. Gibson's eyes flashed with genuine anger for the first time since the confrontation began. "My films? You want to talk about my films? They're honest about what they are. Stories about flawed people struggling with their demons. But you hide behind comedy and claim moral superiority while you tear people down for sport. At least, I don't pretend to be something I'm not." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge that Colbert couldn't ignore. His face flushed deeper as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't further damage his already crumbling position. The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing the complete breakdown of one of late-night television's biggest stars. Social media notifications were undoubtedly exploding across phones throughout the audience, as word of the confrontation spread in real time. "I don't have to listen to this," Colbert said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. The statement sounded more like a plea than a declaration, revealing just how thoroughly Gibson had turned the tables on his would-be tormentor. The host who had started the interview holding all the power now found himself exposed and vulnerable in front of millions of viewers. Gibson nodded slowly, his expression shifting from anger to something approaching pity. "No, Stephen, you don't. But maybe you should. Because right now you're showing your audience exactly who you really are when the cameras are rolling and you think you can get away with anything. Is this really the legacy you want to leave? Is this the kind of host you want to be remembered as?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. Colbert had built his entire career on satirizing others, but now found himself the target of the most effective criticism he had ever faced. His show, his reputation, his carefully constructed public persona, all of it was crumbling under the weight of Gibson's relentless honesty. The host's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk, searching desperately for some way to regain control of the situation. "Get off my stage," Colbert whispered, but the words carried no authority. They sounded more like the last gasp of a drowning man than a command from someone in control. Gibson heard the defeat in his voice and almost seemed to soften for a moment, as if recognizing that he had perhaps gone too far in his counterattack. But then Colbert's expression hardened again, his humiliation transforming into pure spite. "I said, get off my stage. You has-been. This interview is over." The personal insult was his final desperate attempt to wound Gibson, but it only served to highlight how completely he had lost control of his own show. The word has-been echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Gibson's face went completely still, and for a moment, the silence was so profound that the hum of the studio lights became audible. Then, slowly, Gibson began to smile. Not with humor, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who had just been handed the perfect final blow to deliver. "Has been?" Gibson repeated softly, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed studio. "Stephen, I've won Academy Awards, directed films that will be studied long after your show is canceled, and built a career that spanned decades. But you? You're about to become a cautionary tale about what happens when a host forgets that respect is a two-way street." The prophecy would prove chillingly accurate. Gibson straightened his jacket with deliberate calm, his movements measured and dignified in stark contrast to Colbert's increasingly erratic behavior. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? I came on this show tonight hoping to have a conversation about my work, maybe share some laughs with your audience. Instead, you've shown everyone exactly who you are when you think you have power over someone." Colbert's face was now a mask of barely contained rage and humiliation. He had lost control so completely that even his own crew was looking uncomfortable. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become one of the most replayed confrontations in television history. Social media was already exploding with clips and reactions, but the full impact of the disaster was still unfolding in real time. "Your audience deserved better tonight," Gibson continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had reclaimed complete control of the situation. "They came here to be entertained, not to watch you have a public breakdown. They trusted you to be professional, and you've betrayed that trust for what? A few cheap shots at someone you think can't fight back?" The accuracy of the observation was devastating. Several audience members were now openly uncomfortable, their faces showing a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert they had come to see, the witty, incisive host who could challenge guests while still maintaining basic human decency. This was something else entirely, something ugly and small, Gibson began walking toward the exit, his departure, both inevitable and symbolic. "I hope it was worth it, Stephen. I hope those few moments of feeling powerful were worth destroying your credibility and showing your true character to millions of people." The words carried the weight of finality, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing the end of something. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Don't you dare walk away from me," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm not finished with you." But the words only emphasized how completely he had lost control. He wasn't conducting an interview anymore. He was having a meltdown. On live television. Gibson paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. "But I'm finished with you, Stephen. And after tonight, I think a lot of other people will be too." The prediction was delivered with quiet certainty, and it would prove prophetic in the days to come. With that, Gibson walked off the stage, leaving Colbert standing alone behind his desk, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and dawning realization of what he had just done to his own career. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of Colbert's isolation and defeat. The host tried to regain his composure, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Well, folks, that's television for you," he attempted weakly, but his voice lacked any conviction. The audience remained silent, their disappointment palpable. What should have been a routine celebrity interview had become a master class in how to destroy one's own reputation in real time. As the show cut to commercial, the damage was already spreading across social media like wildfire. Yet Colbert meltdown began trending within minutes, with clips of the confrontation being shared thousands of times. Gibson's dignified exit was being contrasted with Colbert's increasingly desperate behavior, and public opinion was forming rapidly. By the time the show ended, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. Gibson had walked away with his dignity intact, having exposed the ugly reality behind Colbert's carefully constructed persona. The host, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of his actions, as his ratings began their inevitable decline, and industry colleagues distanced themselves from the train wreck they had witnessed. The confrontation would be analyzed for weeks, to come becoming a case study in how quickly a career can be damaged when professionalism gives way to personal animosity. Gibson had proven that sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to hold up a mirror and force them to see exactly who they really are. The reflection, in this case, was not flattering. The entertainment industry took notice, and the message was clear. Respect and professionalism matter, regardless of how powerful you think you are.